understanding of the benefits of 802.1x, okay, standards-based. This is not a company pitch, by the way. I work for Forescout. Those of you guys that have talked to me out in the field, outside, my name is Bob Reny. I'm the principal engineer. Yes, it is. That's my computer. So I'm principal engineer for Forescout Technologies. I'm the global tech lead for our company in deploying our technology, but I'm also the 802.1x subject matter expert for our company. Today, what I want to do is kind of demystify what 802.1x is. It's not about us and Forescout deploying it in your environment. I don't care what you use for authentication. I want to demystify and challenge you with some things with 802.1x so you have a broad base and understanding. Okay, and don't be scared of it. And then also understand what your risks are and how you take care of those as you go to deploy, because it's brittle. Does that sound like a good plan? I want this to be interactive. I want you to ask questions as we go through this. And if you guys want to, at the end of this presentation, give me your business card. I'll put you in for a nice, wonderful drawing, but I'll also send you a copy of this presentation so you guys can keep it and use it in your deployment strategies, because it actually includes some checklists in here too. And if you have any additional questions after I send you that email with the PowerPoint, feel free. I'm a resource for you guys. My heart is in Alaska. I started out, I actually worked for Acclaim Technologies up here in Anchorage. Worked up here for about 18 months, and then I moved down to San Jose. Started a company down there, and then transitioned from engineer to sales, and then back to engineering again. I've been working with Forescout for about 6 years deploying our technology. Okay, but this isn't a commercial for Forescout. This is to give you a better understanding of a networking security protocol. So let's jump into what we're going to do today. So I want to demystify, give you an overview of actually how 802.1x works in general, put it in clear, concise terms, so then you can articulate this strong usage to your management teams, right? And even give you some best practices on deployment. Then we'll play into some of the actual more esoteric terminology, some of the things you need to understand to be successful, and then we'll give you some tasks as you go to deploy. How do you reduce risk for your environment, all right? Does that make sense? Right? Now, the reason why I started playing poker, I talked about playing poker, is I'm actually a card player. I play high stakes poker when down in Vegas. So that's why I decided to use some poker analogies. Does everybody deal with that? If you have an understanding of poker playing, everything is about assessing risk. Is the cards you're playing with versus the cards that are being shown versus your opponent. You're assessing risk. And in reality, that's what 802.1x does. But you have to understand the value that it provides you and the amount of information, which is an amazing amount of information about the endpoint, the user, the device, the location, and everything that is connected between you and that user, right? So, what is it? I'm not here to read slides to you guys, so I'll try and allow you some time to read these, but it's a method to be able to apply an authentication to the port. So basically it says, you can't do anything until you provide some kind of credential to me on the network. It's a layer 2 encapsulation using extensible authentication protocol, or EAP, okay, wrapped into a layer 3 method to be able to transmit that credential across the network, because at layer 2, you don't have an IP address, but you still need to authenticate to some centralized authentication service. You can't put an AD or some kind of certificate authority on every switch, can you? Unless you deploy some kind of method to transport that credential. That's what Radius provides, okay? It has originally was designed as a wired communication protection, right? But where is the dominance for 802.1x in deployment today? Anybody? Wireless. It's 100%. What is the benefit with 802.1x in wireless? Anybody? Denial of service. No, 802.1x benefit is just one thing. Beyond authentication, it's key exchange. With WPA2, what is the other method for key exchange for wireless? Anybody? If you can't use a credential, then you have to use some kind of pre-shared key. You guys have all used them. I bet you I go to your house right now on your little Wi-Fi router, you have a WPA2 and pre-shared key set up. You don't use 802.1x. But at a corporate infrastructure, I can't just pass out a new key every week or every day. I have to simplify that process. So the best way is allow the user to use some kind of credential as their device connects to the wireless infrastructure. That's what 802.1x provides. It's become more robust because of that key exchange, but it still has some brittleness, and we'll talk about that. I stole this picture from somewhere online. I'm not sure. I didn't create this image. But part of the reason it shows you that as the device connects, the only thing that you're allowed to do here is actually talk your extensible authentication protocol over LAN. Okay? You can't do anything else. You don't get an IP address. You can't send multicast or broadcast packets across to the other peer clients on your network infrastructure. They are not seen. Literally, the port has a default rule that says drop until the device authenticates or provides some kind of authentication through that extensible authentication protocol. Once you're authenticated, you provided those credentials, then away you go. Okay? Now, what's really cool in that radius command set is I can actually configure my switch or my wireless LAN controller to actually say, allow radius servers to respond back with a network configuration, right? That's pretty awesome. Do you guys know how that works? Radius responds back with what's called a AAA override and says, apply this configuration. What kind of configurations do you think you can do on wireless or wired infrastructure? Assign VLANs, assign access control lists, assign session termination times, all kinds of different variables in that response. So I accept you as a client, and then I apply a configuration in real time. Now, what does that predicate in your environment? That you have a master configuration that's applied to the network. That's complex, right? That's also predicates that I have some way as an endpoint to be able to pass that credential to you, right? This is supplicant enabled on Linux, on Mac OS, on Windows, on a wired endpoint connecting to a switch port by default. Can you name an operating system that does? Questions for you and your teams to be figuring out as you're going to deploy. Therefore, your first risk is if I can't pass a credential to the endpoint, I need some other means for that endpoint to still be provisioned access. What's a good way to do that? Does anybody know? If I can't do 802.1x, I have to fall back or do some kind of other bypass mechanism. Does anybody know what that is? MAB. Great. Mac auth bypass. What's the big security threat there? You're using the MAC address to bypass your 802.1x strong encryption, right? And we're going to talk about all the mechanisms within 802.1x that protect the credential. Still some risk there, but literally you have this strong mechanism to protect the credential passing and verification of that endpoint, and now you're just using a MAC address to bypass that. Big flag, right? Maybe we should do something else on top of that, right? So, part of the reason why I like this picture, if you guys ever looked, you know what SGML is? Standard Group Markup Language. Okay, you've probably heard of HTML, which is a subset of SGML, okay? But literally you have this broad platform, which is literally the process or standard for extensible authentication protocol. And then everything else becomes some kind of nesting within that to be able to pass a credential, okay? So on the outside here for the client, we have 802.1x and ePOL. Then we have radius between the network access server, okay, and the counteract or radius server, counteract little product plug. And then on the back end, the authentication mechanism, the credential validation if you're using user ID and password, okay? But everything becomes nested within that to pass it, to be able to communicate to that endpoint that doesn't have an IP address. You can't authenticate. You can't have any service. You can't have DHCP. You can't have DNS without an authentication according to the requirements for 802.1x. So you need to be able to nest. And it has to be layer 2. So, and this is even before impacts IPv4 and IPv6 networks the exact same way, right? This is your first connection to the network. The important parts for protected extensive authentication protocol are that you have your communication between the NAS, which is your switch or wireless device, wireless AP or wireless controller, talking with the actual endpoint. And then on the back end, you have that radius communication. You have a communication path that actually says when the device first authenticates or connects, we need to share some kind of tunnel. That tunnel is a TLS transaction. TLS, you guys use it every day. How many of you guys bank online? Use Alaska USA Credit Union or Alaska Federal Credit Union. They use, or Bank of America or Wells Fargo or. All of those use some kind of TLS to be able to have an encrypted tunnel between you and that endpoint. That's literally what happens here. With protected extensive authentication protocol, the radius server presents a certificate, and then there's a key exchange, and now they have a tunnel, and then they start passing a credential. Okay, so that's to that tunnel, then embeds what's usually MS Chat v2, which is used in what networks? Who uses MS Chat v2? What operating system? Anybody? Can anybody say Microsoft? The MS being Microsoft as part of that Chat v2, okay? It's just the way to be able to pass the user ID and password or machine authentication token to the directory, okay? So that's encapsulated in within the TLS transaction, okay? TLS, you guys have heard of EAP-TLS? You guys should raise your hands and say, I'm so excited about it, EAP-TLS, it's awesome. You guys excited about it?
Totally.
You guys seem like it. You know why EAP-TLS is better than PEEP? Because I don't have to remember user ID and password anymore. But what EAP-TLS does differently is there's still a certificate exchange, but the endpoint verifies the radius server certificate that's presented, and the radius server verifies the client certificate, because the client certificate is the validation of the endpoint, right? But how many of you guys deploy certificates to all your endpoints today? How many of you guys have tried deploying certificates to your endpoint today? If you guys went to RSA last year and DEF CON as part of the big security round, the NSA actually has booths at both, which is kind of funny. One of their speeches last year at RSA, and they've given it 2 years in a row now, was the vulnerability and certificate management today. You guys have probably heard about this protocol called SCEP, or Simple Certificate Enrollment Protocol, developed by Cisco. But it was to deploy certificates simply to endpoints. But basically you set a password that's used one time for all devices by the administrator, and then every device that has a user ID and password on your network can then request a certificate. Then what starts to happen is you have certificates and more certificates and more certificates. When I buy a cell phone, I think of my cell phone as disposable. Why? Because I travel and I usually drop it. So when it drops, I go to Apple, because I'm, we're not going to have any religious discussions here, but with the Apple appliance, I will then go to Apple and buy a new iPhone. I don't go install and transfer my certificate that was on my iPhone to my new iPhone. I just request a new certificate. But what happens? I then go to eBay, sell my iPhone, right? How many people hang your head and say guilty, right? Yeah. But that certificate that now has access to my network exists on that phone and is now being sold to somebody that sits in New Jersey, because that's where bad things happen, right? So the process to protect your certificate is now broken. What the NSA actually said is your certificate management structure needs to be mature and evolve, and just be like your credential management for user IDs and passwords. About every 90 days, you're changing out your certificates, or you're expiring them. normal certificates, and I'm a lazy administrator for my home network. I actually have a certificate authority, right? And I do 802.1x just because I like to torture my dad when it comes to my network, right? And so I actually deploy my certificates for roughly, a year, maybe 2 years, especially for my boys stuff. I tend to control that a little bit more. But that's normal. That's the modus operandi for all of your AD administrators, right? Everybody can raise their hand and say that. It's okay. Because certificate management is just like managing another user ID account. So that's your risk. So if you're not going to use user ID and passwords, what's the method to be able to protect certificates in your environment? Have you guys ever heard of CRL? Certificate revocation lists. Expire those things out. Now that list grows and grows and grows, and usually you want it to be online. So now there's this new protocol called OCSP, Online Certificate Service Provider or Responder, right? I don't remember that correctly, but so basically is an online certificate forum that verifies certificates. So now I've introduced a process to be able to manage and expire effectively, minimizing my risk to the organization. Now, should I deploy certificates to BYOD? Bring your own device? Everybody should be saying no. Because again, BYOD typically is disposable technology, right? And do you go to your users every day and say, you brought your iPhone to work today, do you still have that certificate? I don't. I mean, our IT team's trying to do that, right, Greg? Yeah. So, the important part with ETLS is you have a certificate exchange, you have a validation of that endpoint, but there is risk. Be aware of that risk, educate your management team of that risk, and then come up with a better process to improve that. That's your challenge. You have to mitigate that risk. You're looking at 2 cards now, and there are 3 on the table, right? Do you have a good hand? Yeah. Security's pretty strong. TLS is a very mature program in general. Using 1.2 or 1.3 or even 1.0, you are better off than nothing at all. Absolutely agree with that. But understand complete life cycle of certificate management as a whole. Now, I've been saying some terms I want to make sure you understand. If you're using every endpoint, you need a shim on that network driver to talk the extensible authentication protocol. That is called a supplicant. The Microsoft supplicant is by default enabled on wireless and disabled on wired. I promise. If you guys all had your Windows, laptops on you right now, I had you open them, and then we look for this, what's called wired auto config, which is actually the supplicant service on Microsoft for the wired interface. Okay? I guarantee it's disabled, not running. Okay? Now on the wireless, it's called wireless auto config. It's always usually enabled because why? People want to do key exchange on wireless. Simplifies the process. Okay? Now, you also have to have configurations on your NAS, your network access server. If you look at RFC 3748, paragraph 2, it actually says network access server as part of that. Okay? So NAS is the device that's actually blocking access on everything but extensible authentication protocol and then encapsulating that radius request. It requires configuration. 1, enabling that authentication, which is a global configuration, and then enabling the radius configuration. How do you audit that? I'm not going to point names or anything like that, but I was actually working with another customer, and being that we have a tool on Counteract on Forescout side that actually can audit configurations, all he was doing was demoing 802.1x, this customer. That was their only requirement. Let me show you 802.1x radius authentication. It's 1% of what Forescout as a technology actually does. But, okay, great, let me show you this. So then I said, hey, how do you know actually 802.1x is deployed? He goes, well, we actually got audited by a company, PricewaterhouseCoopers, or some other NERC/FERC auditing firm, that they guaranteed that 802.1x was deployed everywhere. They signed off on it. I'm like, hey, let's just write a policy and check. If you were to do that as a scripter, what would you go look for? You would look for the radius server settings on the switch globally. Do they point to my radius server? It's one thing to look for, right? And then enabling the .1x, and then configuring the port to accept that authentication. Probably 3 quick things you could write a script for real quick, right? So we did that. Where do you think 802.1x was deployed? How many ports out of 1,500? Anybody? Throw a number out at me. 250. 250. Good number. Anybody else? 5. I like that, 5. This guy has deployed stuff before in security. No, actually 54 ports out of 1,500. And they just happened to be all the conference rooms where the auditors were going to be as they traveled around. Right? So, I mean, it was configured actually at a number of switches, but it just wasn't enabled. Why? If a device, a user, and I'm one of those demanding users, cannot get access to the business tools that I need to do my job, what do? I call the help desk or I call my manager and say, somebody is screwing with my job. And what happens? You guys get the call and it's a Sev 1, right? Work outage, the CEO is blocked from doing their job, you need to fix it. So you remove the configuration for 802.1x on that port. Problem solved, move on to the next issue. Right? How many of you guys have done that? I'll raise my hand because I have. So what you need to do is set a fallback mechanism. If 802.1x fails, user doesn't authenticate, what do? We just talked about it, macOS bypass. Still provision access, but then recheck them. Try and do credentials again. Or set a notification system to something else that, hey, this user is forced unauthorized on the port, but we're still going to allow them access. So the security team knows what's going on in the network. Because they are the ones that are accepting the risk, not necessarily a network engineer. That's where the network and security teams need to be working together. It's not about saying no to the customer. Let's say yes, but enable security for your enterprise. Probably one of the most powerful things that most people don't leverage is way down here at the bottom. How do you like this mouse, by the way? Is that fancy? Change of authorization, okay? This means I have authenticated, and now I, as the radius server, need to make a change to that end user. What does that mean? That means the device is connected to the network, they are doing something bad or negative, or a state has changed on the network, and you need to re-authenticate and then leverage that change of that AAA override to change their risk profile in the network. Change a VLAN, write an access control list, do something. That's the power. So now you have incorporation of pre-connect policy and post-connect. That's what COA gives you. One risk for you guys with change of authority, not every device can support it. It's a newer technology, right? The old Cisco 3750s that we all have buried in some closet somewhere, 12.2 earlier, nope, don't support it, right? Plus, you have to have a radius server that communicates as a client on that switch. So, not every radius server can do that, just be cautious. There are a lot of great radius servers out there. Look at Cisco ICE, look at Aruba ClearPass, look at ForeScout, right? We use free radius, which you guys can use too. You guys ever use Microsoft's NPS server? It's a radius server, pretty robust, even supports COA, right? It's usually free with a Microsoft license. Let's dig into some of this exciting technology, being that we're already 30 minutes, 20 minutes into this, 25 minutes into this discussion. Okay, as a program, extensible authentication protocol has all kinds. If you go to freeradius.org or you go to Wikipedia and you just search extensible authentication protocol, there's probably about 70 different protocols you can use. They have all kinds of different mechanisms, right? The challenge becomes the nature of the endpoint. What has the endpoint used to be able to authenticate to the network, right? So in reality, your limitation of deploying extensive authentication protocol is the limit, not usually the network, it's the endpoint. So look at the standards that are configurable by your desktop teams and easily configured by them to be able to configure extensive authentication protocol that then gets encapsulated in your radius request. The NAS device doesn't ever look at an authentication packet until it gets returned as a radius request back from the radius server as two things: accept or reject. There's no maybe in there. It's accept or reject. That's it. Okay? What's really cool is the peer or the PC or the endpoint connecting to the network, they're the ones that specify what extensive authentication protocol I'm going to use, not the radius server. Radius server will say, yeah, we could use that. So usually you have to configure your radius server to support multiple types. Usually, and then you set rules that if we receive a certain type, we will just respond back with a reject. Okay? Everybody always likes looking at packets, right? It's kind of your spare time. Hey, honey, I'm a little busy. I'm looking at packets. We all do it. Admit it. Be comfortable with yourselves when you're doing this. But literally, you see this initiating request from the endpoint. Okay? This is the radius server saying, hey, I need you to provide me credentials. And the credentials say, I'm going to give you an identity. It's usually a username or host name. Okay? Is that matching the credential that's going to be passed? No, there is no verification in an identity statement. Okay? Other than protected extensive authentication protocol with machine authentication. It's actually used as part of a hash. Okay? But this is really what it looks like. Now what's cool is you see all kinds of other stuff down here in the pack. Source. What does that look like? It's a MAC address. It's usually the MAC address of the AP that I'm connected to on wireless, okay, or the port that I'm connected to on wired. So now I have very esoteric location data about a device connecting to my network. How powerful is that? It's like watching Google Maps of all your employees connecting. Doot, 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 if you can read the matrix as it's scrolling through the radius log. Okay. And then it also gives me some destination stuff about the radius server I'm headed to, Ethernet frame stuff that's normal, and then actually what I'm doing in the extensive authentication protocol. You see the response saying now we're going to do things, and by the way, as a client, we're requesting that we do protected extensive authentication protocol. The client is requesting we do this. And then it even sets TLS types. So make sure your client configuration works. Test it, test it, test it. Test it with an upgrade when you apply patches. How many of you guys go through those programs? And then actually this is what's called a success. This is that accept packet coming back. Because the radius server doesn't just tell the NAS device that the device is allowed, the packet actually gets forwarded to the endpoint. Because if you look at an endpoint configuration, it actually says allow unauthorized or not. And then it also receives the MPPE key, which is that key exchange mechanism for wireless for WPA2. So again, 802.1x uses a key exchange. You need something that translates that. How many of you guys have been using Radius? I'm showing my age here where I can almost open up a phone, call a modem, and then do the, you know. Everybody had AOL at some point up here. You've got 1,000 CDs buried somewhere in your garage, you know, using as table levelers now today, okay. That Radius authentication, Radius has been around forever. It was used as a remote access dial-in user service. It was used for modems, okay? So the IETF standard for communication and every attribute used in Radius has been around for a long. as they pertain to 802.11x is critical for your success. If I want to assign a VLAN in radius attribute speak, do you guys know what that radius attribute value pair is? It's actually called tunnel private group ID equals and then the VLAN number. Okay? If I want to apply an access control list, it's called filter ID equals and then the access control list name. It's understanding those critical components because as a network guy, being a network operations guy, understanding how that correlates to my network or switch configuration or wireless configuration from the IETF standard of radius is critical to understand what current state is and what future state is, right? The hard part for you guys, it's a whole nother language to learn. You guys are really good at command line interface, show conf, interface, gigabit, Ethernet 1, 0, 1, 3, right? If I want to configure the third Ethernet interface. If I want to go to my firewall, I then look at the security access groups, my access rules, my lists, all that stuff. You have to be able to translate that language of your configuration paradigm into radius, right? It's like speaking French to a German. Doesn't always work. Or even French to an American. 28% of the language in English is actually French, the baseline. The numbers are in. Just came in last week, just so you know that. It was 23 before, 28 now. Just kidding. But that language paradigm, okay, in radius, there are things that overlay into traditional communication speak, but even like the term I've been saying, network access server. Most people look at me and what does that mean? It's your switch or wireless controller. You still need to be able to translate that when you're troubleshooting. And you're looking at a radius log, it's ugly. It just streams by ugliness. It's worse than the matrix. And I can't read the matrix yet. Hope to. Can't do it today. Some of the big things, usually it's the username and it actually says user-name. Hey look, there's my 28% of French that I understand as an IETF attribute. You have what's called a called station ID, which is that MAC address of the device that I'm connecting to. I have a calling station ID, which is my MAC address of the device to return back. The NAS IP address. Is the NAS IP address always the switch IP? If I'm using a switch for 802.11x? Come on, you're a network guy. Your NAS IP, when you configure it for radius, and you're doing TACACS, is it always the management IP address of your switch? Yeah, I'm going to tell you it's not. It's not always the same. So that could be a problem. We're getting a radius request from an unknown NAS. Might be an error, right? Something to think about. And then you have the NAS port, usually wireless or Ethernet. Everybody likes pretty pictures, so we're almost done here. When a device connects up to the network, the transaction itself is what's important and how the different devices respond, okay? An endpoint first connects and requests service. It starts broadcasting. I need an IP address. I need my DNS server. I need these. Otherwise, I can't work. The network says, hold on there. You need to provide me some credentials. The guy says, oh, you know what? I got a service for that. Here's my supplicant. You start talking, I'll wait. And then the network card just goes in a wait state. Come on, where are my credentials? And start passing them. Usually what would happen, you got a user, oh, I got a password thing I got to type in and then I can get onto the network. The network switch itself encapsulates those credentials, forwards them to the radius server. The radius server on the back end takes those radius requests, those credentials, and then usually passes them off, especially if it's user a password. Right? It binds into your authenticating directory, passes those credentials with a Kerberos ticket, gets a validation, says they're good, and then sends back an accept. If it's not good, what usually happens? User enters the password again. Let's try this one more time. And fat figure a lot of time. Delay, 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 delay. If they get delayed too long, what happens? Beep, 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 beep. Bob, I can't get onto the network. It's broke. Right? They don't tell you anything. They don't tell you I couldn't authenticate. My 802.11x is down. My wired supplicant is not enabled. They don't know any of that. You have to be able to troubleshoot that. Right? Risk. Wireless, wired don't change. I tried to take out counteract as much as possible because I didn't want this to be a commercial. But if you guys want to, you'll get cleaner slides that saw counteract blip up there real quick. Okay, so let's talk about TLS, because TLS is used in EAP TLS and PEEP. It's kind of hard. PEEP authentication, if we mentioned earlier, was user ID and password, right? But it still requires TLS. What does that mean? Do you have to deploy client certificates out for PEEP? No, you don't. You have to deploy a certificate to the radius server only. That was a trick question. You guys like that? Changing them up a little bit. Okay. The TLS transaction is just a tunnel. It's just to protect the credentials. But you also have to protect the certificate, right? If I grab your phone or I grab your laptop and I have it for less than 30 seconds, I can pull your certificate and your private key off. Therefore, I have access to the same thing you do if you're using those certificates. Realize that. How much of a risk is that in your enterprise? If I see Bob authenticate and I didn't see him come in on a badge reader, how big a risk to my network is that? Pretty big, right? Try and correlate those things together. I made this font really small to make this obscure. Is that good enough? Can I make it smaller? Make it harder to read? The big part of this is I want you to understand, right at the top here, right here, this is the same as an EAP TLS transaction. The rest of this is Microsoft down at the bottom, okay, to protect the credentials, okay? So MS Chap is actually its own credential management system of the user ID and password tokens inside there. But it's to show you that you still have to validate and key exchange and then negotiate your TLS session first. Have that session set up, but usually what breaks, especially as you first go to deploy. The radius server has a certificate on as it's presented to the endpoint. The endpoint doesn't always trust that certificate. Maybe it's not even part of the domain. BYOD. My mobile phone doesn't know about forescout.com, and I'm a Forescout employee. It even has Forescout email. But it doesn't know about the certificate authority that is forescout.com, right? So there's risk. So you have to be able to accept a certificate you don't trust to then start passing credentials. How does an end user know to manage that? Usually they don't. So what do? Call the help desk, right? So come up with a process. We'll talk about that in a second. More packets. Let's all hug each other and get warm packets. All right. Actually, this is a cool one. You're sending the certificate. Hello, here's my cert. All right. This is complex, right? Everybody's kind of starting to glaze over, and I wanted you to do that on purpose, okay? 802.1x to be successful is you need a coalition of effort between your desktop network and security teams. There's no way around it, okay? They each need to understand their cog in your wheel to be successful, okay? The only way you're going to be successful deploying 802.1x on a large scale, more than a couple hundred clients, is if you have coordinated effort and coordinated training of when something fails or when something fails an audit for 802.1x is how successful. That's why it's critical knowing all the subroutines in this. Understand how the endpoint interacts with the network switch, how the switch interacts with the radius server. What are the dependencies in that communication path? What happens if the primary radius server fails and the secondary doesn't have the actual authentication policy or the accept response? Understanding when sessions time out, what happens, right? Those are your biggest risks in deployment. And the only way you're going to come around that is to be successful and have some kind of audit mechanism to look at both and then continuing to train the end user. 802.11x almost mandates that your end users understand something about networking and security, okay? That when they open up a help desk ticket, it wasn't just I couldn't connect. Is I couldn't connect because my credentials weren't being accepted. That then expedites delivery or remediation for you guys, right? That's part of your job, is to mitigate risk, but also still allow users to be able to connect. So, a couple of the key configuration, I'm not going to go through this. This is that checklist portion. Some things to configure on your Windows supplicant if you want to do EAP TLS, or PEEP MS Chat v2, or PEEP EAP TLS. We can keep encapsulating on down, right? The biggest risk for you guys, if you are using 802.11x, you're going to have to use MAC auth bypass. It's a requirement. Why? Does everybody know why? Does every device in your environment have a supplicant? Should be saying no. Projectors are connected. You have cameras that are connected to your networks now. They don't have supplicants. They don't have any way to deploy certificate or user credentials, right? So you need some way to be able to provision that port, because it requires radius, okay, to accept it onto the network. So you have to use MAC auth bypass. It is huge risk in your environment. So what do? My best practice for you guys is provision that device to a limited access network, okay? Do a full assessment. Pull up Nessus. Actually run a vulnerability scan against that device to understand this is an IoT device. It's running a clean version of Apache that's not vulnerable to WannaCry or Samba as part of WannaCry, or the Dyne attack, right? We're just talking about that earlier with somebody. The next door neighbor's Wi-Fi had a vulnerable, switch or wireless AP that was vulnerable to the Dyne attack, right? That device sits on your network. An IP camera was the top, out of the 100 or so devices that were used in the Dyne attack, the top 40 of them were cameras based on wireless or Ethernet to be able to stream video, right, as endpoints. That device still has a need in your environment. Your security team needs to know when Bob Reny enters the building. He's a risk, right? They still need that camera, but you need a way to be able to audit that is your camera, okay? So leverage MAC auth bypass to provision limited access, do your assessment, and then provision, right? Maybe a good way. Understand certificates have weakness, right? Come up with a plan to mitigate that risk for your environment, for authenticating credentials to your user environment, right? Educate the user. This is a team effort. If you guys ever read the book by Stanley McChrystal, General Stanley McChrystal, called Team of Teams, you should. Because it talks about you need to share information across all organizations. So when you go to deploy security, your users are engaged and understand what this changes for them. So they understand the basics of why this is beneficial, right? Don't be afraid to share. Now, my charter for you guys is audit. Audit, 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 audit. Okay, find a tool to audit your environment. So that's what I had for you guys. You guys find something valuable out of this presentation today? Thank you. So if you guys want to give me your business card, I am almost out, so I don't have many to hand out. But you give me your business card, I promise my team will follow up with you guys with a copy of this presentation and my contact information, right? Feel free to contact me directly. I'm a resource for you. I'm going to probably come back up here in January, February. Yes, I know it's cold. Okay, and I'm going to talk at the AITP conference too. So thank you guys. Thank you.